Oppenheimer, who made the atomic bomb. And this man, very depressed when you met him, very noble, very intelligent, very sensitive, and he knew he had committed a great sin. He was aware of it by making the atomic bomb and lived with it. But this man was one of the great scientists of the day, also quoted Sanskrit poetry. He loved Sufism and spirituality and mysticism. And he was really quite a remarkable person. He represented really the tragedy of modern man. A person of honesty and intelligence, forced by system to commit a sin that kills 110,000 people in Nagasaki, and, Japan, and Hiroshima in one day. That's a very difficult thing to bear. But he had the conscience of realizing what had happened.
MSC Sağlık Medikal'in katkılarıyla hazırlanan İzler başlıyor.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Being in Turkey, which is kind of a second country for me, I'll be glad to participate in this program with you. Throughout my life, I've tried to avoid talking about myself, and many requests have been made over the years for me to write my autobiography. I had to write my intellectual autobiography for the Library of Living Philosophers, which came out in 2000. But I've never written my personal autobiography and spiritual autobiography until now, despite many demands. But today I shall be glad to discuss some of my life with you, including its intellectual and spiritual aspects. But let me start with plain facts. I'm an Iranian Persian. I was born in the year 1312 of the solar Islamic calendar, or 1933 of the Christian calendar, in Tehran. I was born into a very well-known family of scholars and doctors. My father was one of the founders of the Iranian educational system in modern times, and minister and secretary general of the Ministry of Education for many, many years. And many people consider him to be the founder of modern Iranian education. He's also president of dean and president of universities and so forth that I shall not discuss. But originally he was a physician. And his father, my grandfather, is really the origin of the Nasr family. He came from Kashan. We are Kashanis. Kashan is a city in the center of Iran, between Isfahan and Tehran. And of course it's a famous name also in Turkey because there are so many Kashanis who are great scholars and scientists and so forth throughout Islamic history, same city. My grandfather came to Tehran to study medicine and left his family in Kashan. My father was born in Kashan, and then my grandfather finally, after 14 years, brought his family to Tehran. And my father was born in Kashan but brought up mostly in Tehran. And like his father, he became a physician. In fact, like his father, he was a royal physician. My grandfather was royal physician to the Iranian kings, and so was my father. And it was the royal title was given by the Shah of Nasr İle to my grandfather, from which comes our family name. And there's also a historical fact. My father was always very meticulous. When Reza Shah ordered all families to have family names, like in Turkey, the Ottoman period, you didn't have family names. All Muslim countries took this from the West. In the old days, it was Hassan ibn Ali and so forth, Al-Iskandari or Bosniawi and so forth. So Reza Shah ordered people to have family names, and my father was always very meticulous in these matters. He has the number one name in all of Iran in his birth certificate. The very first person in Iran who got a family name, the name Nasr. He chose it from the title of his father So my family is known as Nasr. So my father's family is in more recent times Kashani, but they migrated from Iraq during the time of Nader Shah to Iran, and some of them also were in Iran. One of my ancestors in Iran before that is one of the great saints near Kashan. There's a big mausoleum. People go for pilgrimage, a big cupola on his grave. Maluma Taqi, Posh Mashhadi. You don't have to know his name, but anyway. So they were a very prominent religious family that became a scholarly family. And to conclude with my father, which is very important for my background, is that my father, although he was a royal physician, the Shah would give him khalat, what you have in the word in Turkish, so brocade, a very fancy dress every year. But he treated everybody else, the poor would come to him free of charge. They would bring him 2 eggs or something like that. He couldn't make a living, so he left the field of medicine and except for practicing for our family after the Qajar period, and he entered the field of education, and I said was really the most important founder of the modern educational system, which is very important because he also tried to have a continuity with the traditional Islamic educational philosophy and structures in Iran, so there would not be a complete abrupt break, which we see in so many Islamic countries, between our traditional madrasa style education and suddenly modern education brought from France or Germany or England or someplace and put right there, and 2 contrasting and completely contrasting educational systems, which is one of the very, very great problems of the Islamic world, because it trains human beings who have the same citizenship, same color of skin. It's supposed to speak the same language, but 2 different worlds. And we still have this, a problem throughout the Islamic world. You see it in Pakistan, you still see it in Iran. It did not disappear completely. But my father tried to create an educational system. There was no choice. Every Islamic country had to learn Western sciences and learning and so forth. But at the same time, to have a kind of bond with the traditional Islamic education. He himself, what we call in Arabic or Persian, the Jambatain, had both trainings. He knew both the traditional sciences, in Arabic extremely well. He was one of the great masters of the Persian language. I mean, it was proverbial the way he spoke Persian and wrote Persian, and even would correct people in the street if they were mispronouncing a word. He would have his carriage stop and go and say, "Don't pronounce it like this, pronounce it like this." And many jokes were made about him. One of which I will tell you because I will reveal his character. Opium in Persian, I'm sure Turkish name is taryak. And a'la means very good, sort of superior, and it should be written with a ya rather than with an alif in Arabic Persian orthography. And they say my father, the carriage was going in the street and he saw a shop. Said Taryak ala, very good opium. So to tell the driver to stop, and he went to the store and said to the owner, said, "Your opium kills the people. Your Allah is killing me. This should be with a yeah rather than an aleph." So there are all kinds of stories like this about him. I owe him a great deal. He was my also first teacher. Although I was 12 years old when he died. From the age of 7 or 8, I used to sit at his feet. And the little I've accomplished in the field of learning, I owe everything to him. The respect for learning, the respect for culture, the respect, of course, for religion, which is the source of everything, the respect for other cultures, other religions, not being bigoted, not being self-centered. All of these I learned from him. And also, he was very, very meticulous and, in fact, stringent. In my training, besides regular teachers, I had tutors all the time, besides Persian, which I think I know well, inshallah, well, my mother tongue. I began to study Arabic in order to study the Quran, but also French. I had a French teacher for years in Iran. For 9 years, from the time I was 3-4 years old until I left Iran, I had calligraphy lessons with one of the greatest masters of calligraphy, Mir Husseini. Turkey is a great center, alhamdulillah, despite the change of alphabet of calligraphy, artists involved in your country. And Turkey and Iran are the two countries in which has best survived. A great teacher, like your great master that you have here, years and years of training, and I write the shikasta fairly well. I have a pretty good hand, astaghfirullah. But all of this I owe to my father. And also, I had a philosophical mind from the time of a child. I had these ideas in my mind, for example, that if I were not on the earth and there was no heaven, no sky, where would we be? If there were no earth and no heaven, where would we be? This is a very philosophical question. Your children don't ask that question. I would not be able to sleep at night, thinking about that question until the morning, and then I would go and ask my father. So he was really my first teacher. I owe a great deal to him. From my mother's side, they also came from a very distinguished religious family, but more having to do with the Sharia and exoteric Islam. Whereas both my father and his father, my grandfather, were Sufis of the member of the Safi Ali Shahi order, Sufi order. It's a branch of the Ni'matullahi Sufi order in Iran. Safi Ali Shah was a very great master, Sufi master, who was exiled for a while to India and came back in Persian. And in fact, our family home in Iran, all the Nasr family, was near his grave, near the parliament in Tehran right now. And that's where I was brought up. Anyway, he was a Sufi. Whereas my mother's grandfather, his name was Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, one of the most important religious figures of 19th century history of Islam, not only Iran. He opposed the constitutional revolution of 1285 of the Hijrah, saying that this would secularize Iran. They wanted to bring European laws like you brought here, and so many other Islamic countries, even the Ottoman period, the famous changes that were brought about in Turkey, something like that was taking place, and he opposed it, and he was hanged. The first time in history of our country that a great Ayatollah, the most powerful religious scholar of Iran, was hanged, actually, by the instigation of the British, who were behind it, actually, who controlled the prime minister in the Dola, and he ordered it. And that caused a catastrophe in many ways. He had many children, and it left an indelible mark upon them. My own grandfather was his oldest son. He was studied in Iraq, studied in Najaf, which is the center of Shiite learning, and he was a mullah at first, but he came back to Iran and took off his turban, and he was a judge of the Supreme Court. He was a very, very distinguished judge. But in Iran, of course, being a judge means I had to know Islamic law as well, Sharia law. But he was not a mullah, he was not an alim in the ordinary sense, but he was very learned, but in the Sharia. But the other member of the family became leftist, and my mother's first cousin, another grandson of Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, was Dr. Kian Nuri, the head of Iran Communist Party, who died after Khomeini came to power, had a very big role to play in the coming of Khomeini to Iran. That's why he could come back, although he was a communist. He died in Iran after the revolution, although Ayatollah Khomeini was a great religious scholar, but because of the fact that he was a grandson of Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, he accepted. When Ayatollah Khomeini entered Iran, he landed from the plane. He said, "I'm here in the name of Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri. I follow his view." And the biggest maidan, biggest square in Tehran, is now named after my great-grandfather. And bridges and roads and so forth and so on. And Ayatollah Khomeini considers himself the second Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri. So I come from a religious background of two different kinds, from my father's side and my mother's side. And alhamdulillah, I was given the best education possible in Tehran, not only in official schools, but also at home. And also, the most important of all, the heritage, to love learning. Learning always combined with virtue and ethics. And always within a framework of universality. Not to be bigoted, to be narrow-minded, My father made me study Pascal, for example, the famous philosopher, who, however, was a religious Christian philosopher. And he taught me about Christianity, about Judaism, and so forth and so on. So I had a kind of universal background in which I was brought up, and that, of course, had a lot to do with who I became. Then, when my father was very ill, he was about to die. And see what kind of person he was. He was once walking on the sidewalk, and a person driving a bicycle on the sidewalk hit him. And he fell into a ditch and broke his pelvis bone. The person who hit him was his own student. Half of Iran was a student. And my father told him, go away immediately, because the police will arrest you. So he left. An hour later, it was in the afternoon, we were having a nap. People got up and it was in the ditch, and his pelvis bone broke. It brought him home. The Prime Minister came to our house half an hour later and said, Waliullah Khan, my father's name, who was this person? We'll arrest him immediately. My father refused to tell them. Nobody ever found who he was. That's the kind of person, but it has a very famous book in Persian called Knowledge and Virtue, or Ethics, Danish wa Akhlaq, which in fact I published for him. Once I get back to Iran, I won the Royal Award because he wrote so many books I wouldn't publish them. 20 books he wrote, but most of the articles were published. The books were not, and this book, Danish and Akhlaq, which is now a classical book in Persian and been printed 30 times in Iran, which I myself brought out when I came back from Harvard 1958, epitomizes actually what I consider to be important in life and what he transmitted to me.
I guess.
Pardon me?
He has translation of Descartes as well, your father.
No, he did not have. No, it's Muhammad Ali Farouqi, his friend, who translated Descartes. No. My father did not translate any French works into Persian philosophical works, although he knew French extremely well. My father had never left Iran because he used to get seasick or car sick, or he couldn't travel very long. But he knew French so well, he was a corresponding member of the French Academy. So although he had never left Iran, he has a big international presence, you might say, but seen from the point of view of Persian culture. Not simply this westernization, this dichotomy that has been brought into our world. But of course, that tension between East and West was also there. I was brought up in such an environment, and then in 1945, shortly before his death, my uncle, my mother's older brother, was our consul in New York, and they decided to send me to New York, not to be there when my father died. Because he was about to die, and I said goodbye to him. I know I would never see him again. And at a very young age of 12, I came all by myself after the Second World War from Tehran to New York, which was a trip that took a long time. Took 2 months. I spent a month in Egypt. We went country to country. One of our relatives was ambassador to Iraq, so we went in a little plane between 2 people in it, going like this. I can't imagine, I was 12 years old, to Iraq. Of course, their ambassador was very kind and helped me, and then we drove to Damascus, and Damascus drove to Jaffa, which was then part of Palestine. Palestine had not been partitioned. And a train that went from Jaffa to Cairo, we took that, and I stayed in Cairo for another month to find a ship. And there were no planes at the time going to the United States. Alhamdulillah, a Swedish ship was found because all the American soldiers had been brought back, and the Americans had sort of taken over all the ships going to America. It was very, very hard. And even that was really an episode that was very strange. God decides things. I stayed at the Shepherd's Hotel, the very famous Shepherd's Hotel, which was burned down during the time of Nasr, during the Nasr Revolution, because King Farouk used to go there and have lunch and dinner there, especially dinner every Thursday evening. And then on Friday, we'll go to Friday prayers. I met Farouk every night practically. I was sitting over there, I was sitting over here with the entourage, and he played cards, and so I was a very worldly person from that point of view. And anyway, that was burned down, and the new Shepherd Hotel was created. I stayed in the old Shepherd Hotel, and I was sitting down and all by myself eating lunch when a gentleman, very well dressed, with a white shirt and tie, and came forward and said, "Who are you?" I first said it in Arabic. I just do some Quranic Arabic, as you like people in Turkey memorize Arabic. You cannot speak very well, but I could make out a sentence that I don't speak Arabic, but I can understand French. So he began to speak French, and he was a minister in the government. And when discovered I was alone going to America and stuck in Cairo, he said, "As long as you're here, you're my son." He took me to see the pyramids and this and that, and through his influence, got a ticket for me. And so for 1 month, it took to travel from Alexandria to New York. And in December 1945, I arrived in New York and began the second phase of my life. I have a long ways to get to my teachers. Because if we're going to be logic in this, I have to say what went on in America. With the help of the president of Lafayette College, which was a famous college in America, a friend of my uncle, in the middle of the year, was in the 8th grade in one of Iran's high schools, and 2.5 months I'd gone to class. I was traveling 2-3 months. They found actually a very good what they call prep school, private school, in New Jersey, near Princeton University, called PEDDIE, P-E-D-D-I-E, for me, and with the help of Dr. Hutchinson, the head of Lafayette College, and who was a friend of my uncle, and they accepted me in the middle of the year. So when the Christmas holidays were over, in 1946, January 1946, I went to PEDDIE and continued in the 8th grade, despite the fact that my English was very weak, and I just made it. I passed, got a 70 out of 100. The passing grade was not 50 or 60, but 70. I just got the 70 and I passed, and my teacher said, "Oh, why don't you repeat the 8th grade?" I began to cry. I said, "No." But in Iran, in the 6th grade, when you finished elementary school, the exam was national. And I was the #1 student in all of Iran. 50 years later, just in a book in Tehran, "Oh, Dr. Nasr's father was Minister of Education. That's why he made him to be the #1 student, and he got him into Harvard." And so, as if Harvard University would listen to the Minister of Education of Iran, whom to accept. These idiots, astaghfirullah. Just a few weeks ago, somebody wrote this in Tehran. But anyway, that was not the case. I anyway pleaded with them. I said, "Please let me go to 9th grade." I finally accepted, and soon I mastered English, and I became a very good student. And those 4 years at PEDDIE were very difficult, away from home. I was homesick. My father died. It was there that I heard that he died a few months later. I was a student, and everything was really very, very difficult. There were no Muslim students at the school. I was the only Muslim. Later on, an Afghan came, at least there were 2 of us. But we had to go to church every Sunday. But I was, by force, introduced to all different aspects of Western culture. I've gone to church every Sunday for 4.5 years, more than most Christians in the United States right now. I was forced to go. So I began to learn about Christianity. In fact, my father always made me respect all the different religions of the world, so I had no trouble with having respect for Sayyid Isa alayhi salam and for Christianity. It wasn't that at all. I was cut off from our own tradition, from mosque, from prayers, and everything. And of course, I prayed individually to Allah Ta'ala, and I did very well at school, very well. I won't go into details. And in 1950, I graduated from PEDDIE as valedictorian, the #1 student. My picture was in the New York Times. And it was reflected then in Iran that said, Dr. Nasr's son has gone to keep the name of his father alive. Dr. Nasr's son, as my father's son and myself, has gone to America to keep the name of his father alive. And it was the first time my picture appeared in the Persian newspaper as a grown-up. Anyway, so in 1950, this first phase of my education was over, and then I decided to go to MIT. at that time, I tell you that some of the episodes of my life were really a joke. Everybody in my family became very angry. My uncles and so forth wrote and said, "This you ruined the name of the Nasr family. Where the heck is MIT? Why don't you go to New York University or something like that?" They didn't know it was the most important scientific school in the world. 30 years later, I was in Tehran. Everyone wanted to have his son go to MIT. Can you write an introduction of my son? Can you write this? Can you do that? Anyway, the stupidity of our own people in Iran. I was the first Persian student ever to go to MIT. In fact, the first Muslim student to go to as a freshman to MIT. Now there are many. Graduate school, there had been a few Muslims from Pakistan and India and one or two Arabs, but not starting from the freshman year. So anyway, I started at MIT and I spent 4 years there, and there I also had very high honors. And those years are very determining in my life because I had a great crisis at that time, which made me who I am now. That is, I realized that modern physics and science, now I'm studying with the world's greatest teachers, does not reveal the truth. And the reason I chosen physics, because I was interested in understanding the nature of things in a traditional sense, in the sense that Parmenides was called the physikos in Greek, physicist, not in the modern sense. It was my sophomore year that I realized what a mistake I had made. I should not have gone to this field. But the heritage of my father remained with me. So I stuck it out all those years, but I had lost total interest in becoming a scientist. Nevertheless, I finished MIT. I went to Harvard and studied geology and geophysics because that's a descriptive science, and mathematics and physics I studied at MIT is a quantitative science, and I wanted to criticize modern science. The crisis I had actually at 18, 19, in which in a sense I vomited the whole Western civilization, you might say, it was a strong term. It came out of me. I became its critic, and I have had the best education possible. In the West, I became the first really Muslim, really who was armed with the necessary weapons to be able to carry out this task. So I stuck it out, and I went to MIT and then Harvard. After that, turned to history of science and philosophy until I got my PhD from Harvard. But from my sophomore year at MIT, when I lost interest in physics, I began to avidly to study philosophy and religion, and in fact world religions, Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, Christian mystics themselves, very much interested in mysticism. And then this all brought me back to my own tradition, to Maulana especially, whom my father had forced me to memorize when I was a child. We had a teacher at MIT whose name was Giorgio di Santillana, of Italian origin. His father was David di Santillana, who wrote a very important book on the Sharia. He was an Islamicist, an Italian, one of the West's great scholars of Islam. And Giorgio Santillana was a philosopher of science and a philosopher, and was very much interested in Islam and very respectful of it. He was professor at MIT. I began to study with him, and with 4 or 5 other students, brilliant MIT students, we were interested in studying Hinduism. A lot of people at that time, like in the West, who were disinfatuated with the West, would turn to India. You know that whole train of thought. All the people who went through Turkey to go to India with sacks in their back in the 1970s. Giorgio Santillana, we asked him to teach us a course on Hinduism. And he balked and finally said, all right. But if you want to learn it in an authentic way, you have to learn it from the horse's mouth, what's in English as an authentic way. And he introduced me to the writings of René Guénon for the first time. Some of the works of Guénon at that time were already translated into English. The university in America did not assign French books, although I could read French. In fact, all the years at Petty, I'd taken as foreign language French, and as a child I took French. I know French like English practically. I can speak French, I can write French. I don't write too much because changed my English style, but I have written some things in French, but I can speak very easily. I've spoken at the Sorbonne, given many lectures, so it was very easy for me. But they signed it in English, a few had been translated, very good translations, and we imported them from England. They're all published in London, and we began to learn that. Changed my life completely. I changed those works, and I began to read. Two events occurred. First of all, I began to read the whole traditional school. I began to attract to this. And then the library of the great Sinhalese traditionalist Ananda Coomaraswamy was known now in Turkey. I had a role in introducing him to your country many, many years ago. Now he's well known in Turkey also. He was a remarkable traditional scholar who had died in Boston, in Needham, which is a suburb of Boston. His library was in Boston, and his wife, Donna Luisa Coomaraswamy, a Spanish woman whom was his wife, lived right near Harvard Square, Harvard University, by the Coomaraswamy Library. I was able, through a friend of mine who was also interested in traditional matters, to make contact with her, and therefore to gain access to the Coomaraswamy Library. And I read everything you can imagine. Everything traditional you can imagine. None of my students has read as much as I can read it rapidly. I can read in several languages, and everything I could find, I would read. And that introduced me to other traditionalists, besides Coomaraswamy and Guénon, and most of all to Friedrich Schuon. He plays a seminal role in my life, really a seminal role. And I remember, I'll never forget, I read many of his articles in Etudes Traditionnelles. It was a journal published in France, which published articles of Guénon, which is also known by some of your intellectuals in Turkey. In the old days, I knew them. I read some of his articles, but I hadn't read any of his books. He had written originally some books in German at the beginning, 2 books of poetry, Tag und Nacht und Solamet, and also a remarkable work in German, like Gedanken zur Besserung. But I had not read those. I had the books of poetry, but I had not read them. Just a few lines. I know some German also. Not as well as French and English, but I know some German. But anyway, I saw right next to the Harvard Library, as you came out into Massachusetts Avenue, there's a bookstore there. A cover about the bookstore, The Transcendent Unity of Religions. That's the first book that Schuon wrote in French, which de l'unité transcendante de religion. In French was also translated to Turkish. It exists in Turkish, The Transcendent Unity of Religions. And I went in and bought it immediately. And I spent the whole night reading it until the morning. And I said, this man is definitely a Muslim. And he's bringing me back to my own tradition. And I began to say my prayers regularly after reading that book. I've not missed a prayer for the last 70 years. Even when the heart surgery, of course, I was unconscious. As soon as I became conscious, I made up the prayers. I've not missed a single prayer since that. That's seminal in my life, important, that encounter. And anyway, I read and I found his other books, his whole collection, and I tried to meet him. It took several years. And finally I was able to meet him before I was still a graduate student at Harvard. And the same way that I had access to Coomaraswamy Library, I didn't meet Coomaraswamy, but in a sense his personal matters were there. But the question of Friedrich Schuon, he was still alive when I met him. And for 43 years, I was very, very closely associated with him. Spiritually, intellectually, in every way you can imagine. We were very, very close together. And I even published his book, Islam and the Perennial Philosophy, which I put together with his help. And I've written a lot of things on him, actually, and also introduced him to the Persian audience. There are many of his books now available in Persian. and also to the Turkish audience. I had Turkish colleagues and students. And anyway, this whole strand I've tried to describe for you denotes the major figures that had influenced me. But in this process, there are others who are important to mention. Because I was at MIT and Harvard, places where everyone was very important intellectually, sooner or later comes there. There are several people there who had a very deep impact upon me. One of them was Robert Oppenheimer. About whom's recent movie has been made, which I'm sure has come to Istanbul or will come soon. Oppenheimer, who made the atomic bomb. And this man, very depressed when you met him. Very noble, very intelligent, very sensitive. And he knew he had committed a great sin. He was aware of it by making the atomic bomb and lived with it. But this man was one of the great scientists of the day, also quoted Sanskrit poetry. He loved Sufism and spirituality and mysticism. And he was really quite a remarkable person. He represented really the tragedy of modern man. A person of honesty and intelligence, forced by system to commit a sin that kills 110,000 people in Nagasaki, and, Japan, and Hiroshima in one day. That's a very difficult thing to bear. But he had the conscience of realizing what had happened. He made a deep impression on me as far as both this dignity that he had carried within himself and also the awareness of the importance of the consequences of our actions. What we do has consequences. And before Allah Ta'ala, we're responsible for it. And he was a person like that. The deep religious and mystical element in him. Another person was completely reverse of Oppenheimer, but who made an impression upon me was Bertrand Russell, the famous English both mathematician and philosopher who came to Cambridge and to MIT, and I've just been mentioned many times. I've been quoted very, very often in people writing about me. One evening, Georgia de Santana invited 6 or 7 of the leading students at MIT to meet personally with Bertrand Russell. So we met together, just like this room, except a smaller table, about the same number of people sitting around. And I began to ask Bertrand Russell about the relationship between physics, modern science, of which physics is the basis, and finding the truth. And Russell said physics has nothing to do with the truth of things. It only has to do with pointer readings. That is quantitative measurements that you make in relation to physical events. You cannot ask the question, what is an atom? If you ask that in physics, you draw certain formulae and so would describe its characteristics. But its whatness, its nature, its being, you never deal with. You deal with pointer readings. This is one of the main reasons that I left the field of science. It was really the straw that broke the camel's back. I was already prepared for that, and to hear something from one of the world's greatest mathematicians and scientists like Bertrand Russell, philosopher of science, was a very telling thing. He made me sure that my understanding that science doesn't lead to the nature of reality was true. Was true. So that also was a very, very important experience. In addition to that, of course, I had meeting with several very important scholars at Harvard and MIT, especially at Harvard, who influenced me in many ways intellectually. Sir Hamilton Gibb, the great British Islamicist, the greatest that the English-speaking world has produced, who was at Oxford and resigned when Anthony Eden in 1951 attacked Egypt. And he was born in Alexandria. Gibb was no Arab because no Westerner knew Arabic. And he loved the Islamic world. And I became a very choice student. He left Oxford and came to Harvard, became a university professor of Islamic Studies, the title that I hold now at George Washington University at Harvard. And I was a sort of choice student, and I had a very great help he gave me, and he liked me very much. I was very fine. Once we were sitting almost 4/5 of the famous American scholars of Islamic studies who became so much well known, were sitting in this auditorium at Harvard, and Gibb was sitting down there. And we were supposed to have written a paper, which we handed in. And then Gibb said, "Are there any questions?" Some student raised his hand and asked the question. And I was sitting up there, this is auditorium that go down like this. And Gibb turned and told me, he said, "Would you like to answer that?" I didn't know he was talking to me. I didn't say anything. I said, "Hussein, I'm talking to you." I was so surprised that he asked me in class to answer a question that one of the PhD students had asked him. And that was the beginning of a close relationship that we had with each other. When I finished my PhD at Harvard, he himself asked to write an introduction to it. To Introduction to Islamic Cosmology, which exists in Turkish also. That was my PhD thesis at Harvard. And he had never understood really the Eastern part of the Islamic world well. He knew the Ottoman world and the Arab world well, but the Persian world and Indian world he did not know very well. And that was an opening for him meeting me. And also opening to Sufism. The first article that Gibb wrote in defense of Sufism was the introduction he wrote to my book on Islamic Cosmology, which he changed the whole lifetime view, the greatest Western Orientalist of Sufism, and admitted how significant Sufism is for the history of Islam in practically every domain, in every realm. Anyway, I'll mention one of the professors, I've mentioned him elsewhere, also the Jewish professor Harry Wolfson, who was one of the greatest scholars of medieval philosophy, including Islamic philosophy, who wrote probably the best book on the Kalam in English, and who know Arabic extremely well, and who believe that there's one great tradition of thought, which is in Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin, which stresses actually from Philo, who was the first Abrahamic thinker, was a Jew, who encountered Greek philosophy, and goes all the way to Spinoza, where modern philosophy takes over. Of course, he chose two Jews, but that doesn't matter. In between, the most important was Islamic, because Islamic philosophy also influenced Western medieval philosophy. Without Avicenna, there would have been no St. Thomas Aquinas, obviously. So Wolfson was a remarkable ocean of knowledge. A little man like this, but he had such remarkable memory and such remarkable knowledge. I owe a great deal to him. Also, he encouraged me very much. And he paid a compliment to me, which, astaghfirullah, I'm not worthy of, but I will mention to you, when I defend my PhD thesis, I had to defend it before him, Gibb, and I.B. Cohen, who succeeded George Sarton as the professor of history of science at Harvard. I went there to study with Sarton, the great scholar whose book has been translated into Turkish also, history of science. But he died and Cohen took his place. And anyway, when the defense was finished, and Wolfson said, "This is wonderful," he was a little man. It's the first time I've approved a PhD thesis at Harvard written in poetry. Because of my childhood and the influence of Persian poetry on me, there's a kind of poetic aspect to my prose writing even. I also compose poetry in both English and Persian. I'm not a poet, but I doodle along. But I've read a lot of poetry. It has left some effect upon my style of writing and thinking, of course. Anyway, it was with all these experiences that, despite the fact that both Harvard and MIT offered to make me an assistant professor to teach there, I turned all of those down and returned to Iran in 1958 with the hope of never coming to the West again. I didn't know that the God's will was otherwise that I would be exiled the second part of my life back in the United States. Anyone who wants to understand me must understand my relation with the arts. First of all, I'm very sensitive to beauty of all forms, especially, of course, to traditional art. And I was brought up in a home in which there was a great deal of beauty. When I went back to Iran, after I got married, in our house in Tehran, I did not allow a single object of either Western art or Westernized Islamic painters or anything like that. Everything was traditional, either Persian or from India or China. My uncle was ambassador to China. He brought a lot of beautiful Chinese things, but they're all from the Ming Tang period, and they're all classical, all traditional. So all my life, I've been a defender of traditional art. Unfortunately, Allah Ta'ala has not given me the gift of being an artist myself, although I did play the santur for a while as a child, but I put all this aside. The only art I have is perhaps the calligraphy of writing. But my interest in art is central. I believe that you cannot understand traditional civilizations without understanding the traditional art. Traditional art is a universal language which contains within itself the truths of revelation. A ball that you buy here with the geometric design, that's the symbol of Tawheed. All of these designs come back to the center. The center is the symmetry, harmony, centeredness, which we have in Islamic art, what they call the arabesque, the abstract design. The abstract is really the geometry which is related to the archetypal world. Geometry in Islam is related to the archetypal world. All of those are very, very important. I've been very much interested in it, and all my life. Of course, now I'm no longer in this position, but in Iran, a lot of my time was spent in trying to preserve the traditional arts. I found in Isfahan the last master who could make the traditional book bindings, the leather book binding, which were major works of art. And I gave a scholarship to students to go and study with them. The art of putting gold on metal that you still have in Spain was lost in the Islamic world. You know, in Spain you have bases, steel or iron, and then designs are in gold inside. I sent 2 students from Iran and gave them scholarships to go and study. I found the master in southern Spain to go and study with them to revive this art in Iran. I did a lot of things like that. I was very much concerned throughout my life with traditional music. I know a lot about music, although I don't play. You can play 3 notes of any symphony of Beethoven, I'll tell you what it is. I know Western music quite well, all the way from Bela Bartok to Palestrina, from Art Age to the Renaissance, or even Plain-song during the Middle Ages. And also I know Persian and Arabic music quite well. I love Ottoman music. I don't know that much, but it's very close. Ottoman music the traditional music is very, very close to the Persian and Arabic traditions. I said I know Western classical music well, but I'm opposed very much to the attempt by so many Turks and Iranians and Arabs to Westernize their music. I believe that each tradition should be kept in its integral way. I was a good friend, I am a good friend. I've been for years with Yehudi Menuhin, one of the greatest Western violinists. And he made a record, the Ravi Shankar, the great Indian musician, with the 2 played together. But each played according to his own tradition. They didn't mix things up. And when I was in Iran, I invited Menuhin. He was coming from India to Iran. And he came and I gave a dinner for him. And after dinner, I had some Persian musicians come and perform classical Persian music, completely classical, very similar to what you hear, you know and you hear. And when he heard that, I said, Mr. Miniman, what do you think of this? He said, this is the ladder between heaven and earth. A great missionary understood. And from that time on, he became very much interested in the music of the Islamic people. I've had a lot to do with the Fez Festival that is now being held. The person who created the Fez Festival, which is the most important musical festival in the Islamic world, is being held right now. He came to see me before it was founded and asked my advice what to do. And invited me to inaugurate the first lecture. I didn't know, like, so I didn't have time, I didn't go. But it's now a major event, and I've done a lot in preserving the traditional musical traditions of the Maghreb and Musiq al-Andalus, which was the old Islamic Andalusian music of Spain, and which has been preserved in northern Morocco, in Tetuan and those places, and now becoming very well known. It's a beautiful form of Islamic music, Musiq al-Andalus, not to be confused with flamenco. Flamenco itself also has Islamic origin. And I'm a very great admirer of flamenco. I'm very sensitive to music. I cannot bear bad music. Modern music is, I call it cacophony, it's not music. Music penetrates the soul, it's a very deep art. You sit here, it goes right into your being. Whereas a statue is up there, it doesn't enter into your eyes. Music enters right into your body, into your brain, into your heart, into your soul. And that's a very, very sensitive thing. And one of the great forces to destroy religion in the modern world is this kind of music, which aggravates the animal-like instincts in man and destroys the spiritual elements. I mean, there are always exceptions. A few songs here and there, especially folk songs. Well, folk music is different from this modernized music. But we live in a very, very chaotic age as far as music is concerned. On the one hand, because of the new methods of recording and so forth and so on, the rediscovery of so much classical music, even Western music. I worked for 4 years at the music library at MIT. I was the first music library in the world. I would put discs to be played. At that time, Vivaldi was just becoming known. Now Vivaldi is all over the place. Everybody knows his name. At that time, nobody even knew his name. That's in my own period, 50, 60 years ago. Things have changed quite a bit. A lot of the rediscoveries made. The medieval music, playing chant, Gregorian chant, which was preserved only one monastery in France when I was a student at MIT and Harvard. And they made a recording of that. And I was brought to Cambridge. And when we sat with 7 or 8 of the sort of estate PhD students of interest in music, listened to a Gregorian chant for the first time. We were amazed, absolutely amazed. And in our own tradition in Islam, not only do we have this classical music, but we also have chanting of many kinds, starting with the Quran. Every tartil of the Quran has a musicality to it. Even the Saudis who are against music, when they make the adhan, you can write down musical notes. You know, it's the Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. It's the Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. That's a note of music. It's a note of music. And the Quran is source really of music in Islam in a sense, but in a very deep spiritual sense. In a very deep spiritual sense. And that's why the question of music from a Sharia point of view in Islam has always been an ambivalent one. Some ulama have been against it, others have not. Ghazali, both Ghazalis, have written remarkable treatises on Islam and music as a point that is debated and discussed to this very day. I think I've said that often, the most profound fatwa that an alim, Islamic alim, has given on music was given by Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini had a side to him, was devoted to Sufism. At the age of 20, 21, he looked for a spiritual master, was initiated into Sufism. He knows a lot about Sufism, about Ibn Arabi. He's a massive teacher. He was, he's dead, a teacher of Ibn Arabi, Mullah Sadra, all of Gnostic, Irfani tradition of Islam. And when he came to power, the Islamic Republic came, suddenly the Iran radio and television stopped playing music because the ulama were against music, supposedly. After a while, they realized that you cannot have this any music at all. So the head of the Iranian television, whom I knew before the revolution, he wrote a letter to Ayatollah Khomeini and said, please clarify for us what we can do. We cannot have a station without having some kind of music. And Ayatollah Khomeini wrote a wonderful, wonderful treatise on what kind of music is halal, what is haram. That is, as Ghazali said, the same Persian, موسیقی آنچنان را آنچنان‌تر می‌کند. That is, whatever exists in the soul, it accentuates. If you have in your soul the love for God, it accentuates that. If you have in your soul the love for the world, it accentuates that. That's why in Islam, social music was limited, but spiritual music was very much accentuated. But the Sufi practice is called sama. Sama does not only mean hearing, it also means music. The Molavi order, I mean, for 700 years, all of Ottoman music was kept by the Molavi order. It's deeply related to Tasawwuf, deeply, and still is, many different forms of orders throughout the world. So this issue is an extremely important issue. And you have this ambivalence. On the one hand, because of modern means of communication, you have so much cacophony, so much bad music. Even repetition of good music over and over again. You go to the drugstore, and they have some Beethoven symphony all the time. It becomes like electric sound, terrible sound. Despite all of that, there's also been a remarkable discovery of a lot of musical works, musical traditions, and going back to authenticity. For example, in Western music, it's a whole story, I cannot take your time now, that they tried to, in the Romantic period, romanticize Baroque music in the West. For example, no one used the harpsichord anymore, everyone used the piano, playing Bach on the piano. But Bach had no piano, he played it on the harpsichord. Then when I was at MIT, that's when they began to rediscover the harpsichord. Now people are interested in music, even in hearing. You have some people have harpsichords. 100 years ago, no one in Turkey would hear of a harpsichord. They didn't know what it was. So there has been some comeback, along with, unfortunately, this pollution of sound, like the pollution of air that we have, pollution of sound, which unfortunately is one of the conditions of our times. First of all, our youth should know that Islam is not only a reality in the past tense, it's a reality in the present tense, and it shall be so in the future. The reality of Islam is not exhausted by the passage of time. And the idea of modernism, that everything soon becomes dépassé, as the French say, and out of date, is not true. It's not true. Look at nature. Next year, this apricot tree is going to give apricot again. Don't say, I've now outgrown this and I'm going to do something else. It's only we human beings who, through the loss of the knowledge of who we really are trying to, in a sense, worship change in every domain, and that includes art, science, philosophy, music, and most of all, religion. So my advice to our youth is, first of all, not to be over-impressed by what the modern world of the West does because it's more powerful militarily or economically. It itself is on the throes of death. Modernism in the West is dying. Everybody knows that, who's intellectual, who's at the center of things in the West. One of the greatest criticisms of modern civilization in the last 50, 100 years have been written by Westerners. Not by us or by Chinese or Indians, but by Westerners. And therefore, they should have a sense of confidence in themselves. That's the first thing. Secondly, to try to discover what we have. Hafiz, the great Persian poet, has a line which is very telling for our times. I'll cite it for you in Persian and I'll translate it for you. He says, Salha del talab jam jam az ma mikard. Anche khod dasht ze bigane tamanna mikard. For many a year, our heart was requesting the cup of Jamshid, this mystical cup in which everything could be found, from us. What it had itself, it was trying to find elsewhere. This is our situation. This is a poem of Hafiz that was written for us. We're always trying to find elsewhere what we really have ourselves. So self-knowledge, self-confidence in ourselves, in our tradition, and not only for the young, for everybody, especially the young who are going to be the next generation that will rule over our civilization, is very, very significant. They also should know that they'll be the first generation really in the Islamic world that has to face fully the consequences of the environmental crisis, of the evils that we have done to nature, and the consequences of it in so many different ways. And they should therefore not to simply continue these errors, but try to rediscover the Islamic view of nature, about which I spoke yesterday extensively, of being also God's creation and our friend rather than our enemy, to dominate, to satiate simply our desires, to learn to love nature and to be friends with it. But most of all, my advice, of course, to the young is do not stop your love and devotion to God. Always remember that we are His abd. Doesn't matter what century we live in, that does not change. There is no date in La ilaha illallah. It's not a 17th century idea, it's not a 20th century idea, it's an eternal idea. And remember that the verities of religion are there for not only your fathers and grandfathers, but for you and for your children, and they shall always be so. And finally, never lose hope in God's mercy. Do not become bitter. It's so easy to become bitter in the modern world. Do not lose faith. Do not lose hope. That's what I pray for them.
MSC Sağlık Medikal'in katkılarıyla hazırlanan İzler sona erdi.